Thank you for joining us. I'm Ken Trump, President of National School Safety and Security Services, and we're happy to have everyone take time out from your busy day to be with us for our webinar on the latest school safety challenges and strategic crisis leadership with risk and crisis communications to manage a number of school safety challenges that we are facing nationwide in schools with the return to in-person learning. With me today are my colleagues and friends who provide very unique perspectives on school safety. First, Dr. Christine Eith, also known as Chrissy Eith, professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Education on the research methods team, and with a background specifically in school safety, juvenile delinquency, and related research. Prior employment included working at the Department of Justice, analyzing data on juvenile delinquency and juvenile crime. Also with me is Chuck Hibbert, my colleague, Senior Consultant at National School Safety and Security Services. Chuck and I have both had more than 30 years of experience nationally in school safety, security, and emergency preparedness planning, working in school districts, in leadership positions, and consulting across the country, doing professional development training, school security and emergency planning assessments, expert witness work, and related types of school safety consulting. You'll also hear today an interview that we did with my colleague, Dr. Erica Carswell, who is an expert in special education, inclusion, diversity, and school climate issues, as well as employee wellness, educator wellness in schools, in a recorded interview that we'll share later on in this session. So we want to make the best use of your time, so we will be moving quickly today. Understand that we're just scratching the surface in this 1 hour session, but it will give you multiple lenses on what's going on nationwide. Across the country, it's been quite concerning, particularly in the last couple of months, as more students return to in-person learning. We have found a substantial uptick in serious behavioral incidents, large-scale fights, particularly at high schools, an increase in weapons confiscation, and related school safety issues that, by anecdotal measures and feedback from people across the country in education and school safety, is substantially higher and more than expected for this time of the school year. Some other trends that we've seen is a reversal of the removal of school resource officers in those school communities that decided, particularly post George Floyd, that they wanted to remove school-based police and school resource officers. We're seeing a quick effort in many of those communities about a year or two later here, from those that had removed SROs, to bringing them back. One concern that we have is the escape to remote learning as a crutch by some school administrators around the country when school threats and school violent incidents happens. Large-scale fight in the hallways, a weapon rumor, social media goes out of control, and school administrators are quickly forcing children back to remote learning, out of in-person learning. And there's a great deal of concerns there, particularly when we know that the social and emotional anxieties and stressors that occurred from remote learning are contributing, most believe, to the uptick in violence. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to use that tool that 2, 5, or 10 years ago was not there. So we want to talk about how to deal with those issues. And school safety, the phrase has been changed in the last year and a half to really refer to COVID school safety rather than traditional security and emergency planning. And as a result of that, we're finding, as we enter the current school year, that many school crisis teams have not been reconstituted. School crisis teams have not met. Emergency plans have not been updated in some school communities for a year and a half to 2 years because of COVID. And that's quite concerning, because with children back in school, we are seeing security and crisis type incidents that would fall under those plans that have not been reviewed. We're also seeing early indicators of educator burnout, which Dr. Carswell will talk about. A month into the school year, people are still tired and stressed as adults with COVID. And a turn to metal detectors and other security equipment and hardware very quickly in response to some of the larger scale fights and behavioral problems. It's a quick fix we're seeing in too many school districts around the country. Let's just throw in metal detectors and additional equipment and hardware, and that way we'll have a visible, tangible evidence that we're doing something, quote unquote. But I can tell you that in all the expert witness work that Chuck and I have done on school security civil litigation cases, we know that while the facts and merits of every case vary, the allegations across the board in most cases tend to be allegations of failures of people, not products, people's actions or inactions, policies, procedures, training or lack of, rather than an allegation that some equipment and hardware has not worked. And I've worked on cases from the Sandy Hook and Parkland school shootings, San Bernardino school shooting, to rape, sexual assault, and other types of cases. And that's a very consistent observation that I've found. So we have to balance out the hardware and the heartware, the human piece of this, to make sure that we're not overly relying on equipment for a human problem. And Chuck and I talk a lot about, in particular, along with Chrissy and Eric Carswell, about the idea of a comprehensive approach to school safety, that there's a continuum of threats and there must be a continuum of responses, not just a reliance upon one type of strategy alone. And we get into this debate nationally a lot about, do we need more equipment or more intervention, social, emotional, mental health services for kids. And we believe strongly that it's a comprehensive approach to school safety, that you have to have not either or of those broad approaches, but both. They need to go hand in hand. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Eith to talk about the limitations of school safety data and the importance of collecting data at your own school-based level or district-based level. And then to segue into a discussion on her observations and research experience as to what the pandemic stressors are, how they're impacting educators and students, and what we can do about that. Chrissy?
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, so I really appreciate sort of the opportunity to chat with you all today about two issues that are really important from my vantage point, at least. The first one, as Ken pointed out, one of the challenges that I think we all have is a reliance on data, particularly right now with a focus on education being very data-driven and evidence-based. Those terms are thrown around a lot, they're used a lot, but the question is what data and what evidence? We have nationally a real dearth of what we could look to understand what school safety really means and what practices are working. It's very similar to the work that we see across law enforcement agencies, even the idea that just because it worked in New York City doesn't mean it's going to work anywhere else. So I would challenge every district to think about what their safety plan is and how are they evaluating their safety plan in a way that truly is collecting data that's relevant and appropriate. That doesn't, another area that we tend to see a lot, I've worked across a number of districts, and the one consistent thing that I have seen is that, for instance, behavioral data, meaning disciplinary data, is not always organized in a way that is the most immediately operational for examining whether or not there is an issue with behavioral problems. The other part that I would say is what we see in the school carries into the community and vice versa. So the idea of thinking outside of your school when it comes to data and understanding, most schools have MOUs with other state and local agencies. It might be helpful to understand what behavioral what we're really talking about when we're thinking about the behavior around safety. So is it a matter of someone having a suspension? Is that suspension in that out of school space actually sort of carrying over into the community disorganization? Vice versa, if we know that there have been issues in the community where there have been situations where groups of kids have had altercations, that it's not unlikely to think that that would carry over into the school as well. So having that intelligence from your law enforcement agencies, from social workers, from other service members within the community can really help. So that idea of having a community partnership around data is really going to be critical. The other part of this sort of idea around school safety, I think, kind of comes back to and sort of segueing into what psychological safety really looks like. One of the things that we talk a lot about within the SEL space, there's so much data that is being collected around social emotional learning, the 5 pillars of social emotional learning. Each state has their own evaluative plan that is set in place to manage and explore what their social emotional growth is. One of the things that is not accounting for right now is the collective trauma that we've experienced through the pandemic. And that collective trauma is going to lead to a disruption of any feeling of safety that we have. That's true whether you're a superintendent, whether you're a parent, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a student, whether you're a member of staff within the building. So we have to first, at least this year, or from last year and this year, understand that this collective trauma is going to throw off any normal plan or any idea that we're going to implement some sort of evidence-based practice around social emotional learning. So I'm going to challenge everyone to kind of go back to the scenario, and I have heard this in the past, but never have I heard it more frequently than over the last 2 months, which is we need to think about Maslow over Bloom. The idea that our basic needs and our psychological needs have to come first before we are ever able to deal with any sort of learning. So in the spirit of Maslow, a couple of the focuses that we have to really go back to is exactly what does it look like to disrupt your sense of safety? The idea behind that is going to lead to mental distress. You might see that in the forms of loss of sleep, lack of attention, anxiety, depression, and a number of other orders. It also reduces self-esteem and the ability to self-regulate, which often can lead to, in practice, shorter fuses, more disagreements, and ultimately creating a lack of cohesion within the building as opposed to kind of bringing folks together. So my suggestion as we kind of move forward is asking teachers to kind of focus on SEL practices right now when no one is feeling particularly ready to do that, is to step back and think about why we are really thinking about SEL. The focus there really was psychological safety, meaning being in a place where it's okay to model mistakes. It's okay to have to feel a lack of judgment when something doesn't go the way it's supposed to go, and also build the relationships back. That starts, and again, I've had this conversation over the last few months with a number of teachers, classroom teachers in middle and high school. It starts with having to re-norm your class. The remote learning experience reduced while adding stress, it also reduced students' ability to remember what the norms were in the classroom. What were the behavioral expectations? We can't assume just because you're coming into 9th grade that you know what the behavioral expectations are anymore. They need to be articulated, they need to be clear, and they need to be reinforced. That's not necessarily something that we want to do, particularly when we're worried about the slide that teachers are expecting from their kids, right? Teacher expectations and teacher accountability means that they have to get these kids up to speed really, really quickly and don't have time to reinforce behavioral expectations. So again, this runs through the hierarchy of school leadership as well, which is giving your teachers, and I know Dr. Carswell will speak to this, but giving your teachers the space to be able to help the kids so that we can get to learning. Teacher accountability right now is a really big challenge when we know we have a year's slide or a year's learning loss that we have to account for. So the idea of safety is really going to start with active listening, building relationships, and actually sharing values that can re-norm our classrooms. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Ken.
Thank you. Awesome. And I think that that key point cannot be stressed enough is that is this the new normal? We hope not. We hope eventually we'll get back to the old normal, but right now we're not normal in terms of what we're dealing with. And people, just like when you deal with death, grieve in different ways at different times over a different period of time. We're going to see those kids who face a lot of these stressors. Some are going to be acting out now. We may not see it in others till later down the road, or we may see depression and withdrawal. So understand again, as Dr. I said, this is individualized, and it's not just one and done. And Chuck and I have seen this in schools we've worked with after active shooter incidents in schools. We talk a lot about how educators come together very quickly to provide support services for students and the extended community without taking care of themselves. And we worked in one school many years back where a young man brought a tree saw and a machete to school and attacked kids in the first period class. We went in to work with that district several weeks in the month or two thereafter. And we went in to visit the school nurse, and I'll never forget this. And we walked in the door and Chuck just said, "How are you?" And this was weeks after the incident. And she broke down in tears and said, "I'm not doing that great, but you're the first person who's asked." And too often when we have these incidents, we have a faculty meeting, tell the staff if you need some support, dial the employee support program number and move on. So understand that this grieving and this impact's going to happen over a long period of time. And one of the places that we're seeing that is in the impact of staff shortages. Teachers, substitutes, bus drivers, food services, all positions, just like elsewhere from fast food and the other businesses throughout our communities around the nation, are suffering from staff shortages, short-term or long-term. And Chuck, could you talk a little bit about how staff shortages are impacting schools or could impact schools from a school safety perspective?
Well, I think obviously if you don't have all the people, you don't have all the members of your team on the field or on the court, then your game is going to suffer. And of course, the game we're talking about today is staff and student safety. So it is important to have the subs in place and that they've been properly trained. One of the things that we're seeing across the country, as Ken just mentioned, is burnout. And particularly in classified positions, we're seeing people leaving the schools to take jobs elsewhere. A very common expression that we heard in a district we were working with in North Carolina was they were losing bus drivers to Amazon because people could go to Amazon, make more money, and have a less difficult stress level. Because as we know, driving a school bus is not an easy task. But we're seeing this across the board within building positions and within transportation. So I think it's important that we recognize, as it's always been, this is nothing new, how important it is to have subs trained and aware of their responsibilities. People are always going to respond better if they know what to do. So often we've talked to people after a major event and people will say, well, I just didn't know what to do. And so what happens is people freeze. And that's the worst possible result that we could possibly have. So I think it's just the question, we're going to ask a lot of questions for those of you who are participating today. And one of those questions is, what have you done about staff training? What are you doing about staff training? And we recognize there's a great deal on your plate right now, but the question has to be asked is, what are you doing to help people, help your staff through this difficult time? And one of those things does involve a training. Now, we understand time is the most valuable commodity that we have. And so I'll just simply share with you what I developed out of necessity, was called the 5-minute rule. And so it became, because of curriculum demands and other issues, time to focus on school safety became very limited. So I finally asked, could I have 5 minutes? And so it became the 5-minute rule, and suggested and is implemented at the building level, the grade level, department level, whatever, the 5-minute rule. And here's the key to the 5-minute rule in regards to addressing school safety. The key is, yes, 5 minutes, but it has to be the last 5 minutes of your agenda. Because if you start talking about school safety, the first thing on your agenda, then it's very likely that you will not get to any of the other items for the reason why you called this meeting. Also, the 5-minute rule, if you have it as part of every meeting at every level, then it becomes, it says to staff, school safety is important, because we do discuss it at every meeting. So, and that's an emphasis, because Ken and I often hear when we're doing assessments from staff, well, we haven't heard anything since the back to school meeting about school safety, where they reviewed our emergency plan, and that's about it. So the 5-minute rule we found to be a very successful item to be implemented within your, again, at the building, district, department, every level, 5 minutes. And this doesn't have to be anything significant in regards to school safety, because there are so many fundamentals that can always be discussed. But the 5-minute rule. Ken?
And that may include anything and everything. At 5 minutes could be talking about one item that's a priority at your building level if you're a building administrator. For example, in the faculty meeting, take 5 minutes at the end of that meeting. And let's talk about hallway supervision. What assignments do we have with people? Where do they need to be? Where are we seeing congregations and problems? Or maybe it's 5 minutes to talk about one component of your emergency plan, parent-student reunification, if you have to leave your site, evacuate, and go to another location. Or it could be lockdown procedures, or it could be bullying and dealing with aggressive behavior and bullying and expectations for behavior in the building. It could be employee wellness, but taking 5 minutes, A, conveys information. B, it moves it to the front of mind. C, it communicates to your staff that school safety is a priority, and it's something that you can get feedback from people on and ideas by having those conversations. And one of the best tools that we found for having conversations to ramp that up to the next level is tabletop exercises. I think one of the most productive, meaningful things that we have done, while professional development has been one, the tabletop exercise of professional development, where we take a half day in many school districts or schools, individual schools, independent school, and we spend some time going through hypothetical scenarios with building teams, administrative teams, district level crisis teams, first responders, mental health professionals, your communications personnel, your social workers, counselors, school psychologists, and bringing everybody to the table and working through an abbreviated scenario. We recognize time is difficult to get. We'd love to have a whole day, but we could do it in a half hour, or excuse me, a half day, and bring people in, go through a hypothetical scenario for about an hour or so, and then debrief that, because the conversations that are started at those tables are invaluable. And what we learn is that the vast majority of schools that we've worked with. They have many great plans on paper, but when it comes down to practicing those plans or knowing what's in there or going through the what if scenarios, either a third or more of those plans get changed after a tabletop. Things are missing, things need to be taken out. People don't even know what's in their plans. And it's just an extra tool that may take a little time, but it's probably one of the most valuable things that you can do, is to have a tabletop exercise to make sure that what's in writing is actually in practice. And that was one of the charges a superintendent in Indiana gave to us many years ago. Chuck and I were retained by the district to do a school security and emergency planning assessment. And we went in, met with the superintendent. We said, "Superintendent, what do you want us to do? What's your priority here for us?" And she said, "I want you to find the disconnects between what's on paper and what's actually in practice." She says, "Because my administrative team's telling me everything's fine, they've got it covered." She says, "And I've been around for a few decades, long enough to know that that's just not the case. Everything's not perfect." So she said, "I want to see what those holes are." And when we do assessments, before we come into a school or school district, we look at what's in paper, what's in policies, emergency plans, what's in writing. Then we come in and speak to the leadership and then the building level people. And then we do the physical security piece. The reason I share this is because there are oftentimes so many disconnects between board policies or school policies, literally policies and regulations, and then what actually the administrators believe is going on, and then what's actually going on. And those disconnects are where you find things fall through the cracks when you have a real security threat, a real incident. It's also where you increase your potential for liability, as we know from doing expert witness work, because what you say on paper is not what's going on in practice. And there'll always be room for some flexibility. That paper, your emergency plan, should really be guidelines. But it's an area where people look to see, are you doing what you say you're doing? And one of the areas that we're dealing with now is managing fights. Typically in the past, when I've seen news stories on fights, they're middle school related, and those certainly occur, but there's been an uptick in the last couple of months as we return to in-person learning with large scale fights, riots, incidents with weapons, cases where parents have been arrested. One parent had a 40-year-old mother was just recently arrested after a large-scale fight, or as a part of a large-scale fight, and she was armed. She had a weapon. We have had multiple cases around the country with parents and family members in the hallways engaging, or in some cases perhaps starting or instigating those fights in the hall. So it's become a concern, particularly at the high school, and there's a pattern of that we're seeing. And we know that there are many ways to manage that. And shutting down schools, going to remote learning, in our opinion, should be a last resort, and most likely after a school shooting. When we know, going back to Columbine, one of the major lessons learned was to return to normalcy in schools as quickly as possible after a school shooting. So there's been an effort literally now for a couple of decades that if you have a shooting incident, to get students and staff back into normalcy ASAP. Once that building's no longer a crime scene, if you're able to resume operations physically and structurally and cleared by law enforcement, to get people back into the buildings. But yet we're seeing now schools literally forced to remote learning just because of an unsubstantiated social media threat. And if we agree that remote learning is harmful academically, socially, and emotionally, and we agree that the social emotional stressors are what's contributing to the violence we're seeing, there doesn't seem to be a lot of logic to sending your kids back to remote learning, which is a cause or major contributor of this in the first place. So one of the things that we look at in terms of and train staff on in schools and their crisis team is managing fights. The first is looking at common hotspots. And we know that oftentimes, while there are fights in classrooms and incidents, that they more often than not, in common areas, bus arrival and drop-off areas, cafeteria, hallways, restroom areas, class passing, breakfast, lunch periods, and other places where you have greater student movement, a tendency for less supervision, and a place that needs the supervision the most. So we encourage our teams that we walk through in training, what are some of those hotspots and how do you manage that? And it often goes to the issue of supervision. Now, we've worked in school safety for more than 3 decades individually here, in addition to even more collectively. And quite frankly, we had a conversation a week or so ago. We talked about, do we really need to train people, educators, teachers, support staff, administrators, on how to supervise? And the answer was yes. We came to the conclusion that there are some things that we can train our staff on, and we can train our school leadership team on what needs to be addressed in supervision. Because I can tell you that from expert witness work in civil litigation, one of the most common issues, while the facts vary, is allegations of failure to supervise, negligent supervision that led to, or is alleged to have led to, a violent act or incident. Whether that's a wrongful death, whether that's a stabbing, a shooting, or other type of incident. Chuck, do you want to talk a little bit about supervision and also non-violent crisis intervention as a training and techniques as a resource?
I'm going to try to give you some what I call nuts and bolts specifics that I think you need to, that if you're responsible, if you're the school safety leader in your district or building, some of the things you need to look at from a supervision standpoint. And one of those is simply staff awareness of their duties and responsibilities. I remember working in the district prior to my retirement, had a major disturbance in the school cafeteria. As it turned out, one of the assistant principals was in another part of the building when he had primary responsibilities for overseeing the lunchroom. He wasn't the only person there, but he was not in his assigned duty location. And so it's important for people to review that, particularly since we've been out of school for so long. Have those responsibilities been updated? Have we talked to folks and told them where they need to be? And also just the visibility of staff is critical. Passing periods. Where are your teachers, as an example? Where is every adult? We talk a lot about the responsibility of school safety is a responsibility of every adult. But too often we go into secondary buildings and in passing period, we don't see staff standing outside their doors. And so that needs to be reviewed and a point of emphasis from our standpoint. Now, nonverbal awareness is also very important. And there are several excellent training models being offered around the country. But I would simply say to you that staff needs to trust their instincts and their experience. And so what I've used the phrase, my cat's getting ready to walk across the screen here if I'm not careful. What I've used with people is that they need to, I call it managing the range. When you have it's a poor analogy, and so forgive me as not being necessarily child sensitive, but roaming the range and watching what the cattle are doing. And so what are our children doing? What have we learned? What do we know? What kind of nonverbal cues can we learn and react to those cues? And so a lot of this is prevention. Also, one of the things that we've often seen is a breakdown in communications within the staff structure. Sorry, my cat is here. Is in regards to communication. Oftentimes, a child will speak to a trusted adult, whether that be a support staff member in a classroom, whether that be a guidance counselor, but sometimes those messages are not then communicated up and across departmental lines so that administration knows that they've heard about something going on here and respond appropriately. So I emphasize those kinds of just nuts and bolts aspects of what's going on. And we need to be aware, and if the duty assignment is, for example, before school, after school, cafeteria in particular, keep moving. Don't stand in one spot too long. I used to supervise our high school football games. And one of the issues, we used a lot of off-duty police officers. And what one of our challenges was what I call cop clumps. And the officers would have a tendency to gather and stand and talk to each other about like issues. This is also true of staff at virtually every level. So as a supervisor or a school safety leader, you need to watch for that and make sure people are moving and on their duty assignments. Ken?
Thank you, Chuck. And I think that just shows that no matter how many physical security barriers we have and how many risk reduction measures, there could be an intrusion into the facility, even by our cat. And that is, and if that's the worst we have in the remote world today, we're doing great with, as long as it's our four-legged friends. So I think those points are giving verbal command, training staff on how to give verbal commands when intervening in fights, use of space and dealing with escalated behaviors. All of those nonverbal interventions and are things that we can really spend additional time talking about and as part of the overall training of staff on supervision. And we talked about physical security and just briefly here, we know that there are some good uses. When we say physical security, we're talking about equipment, hardware, and technology. And there are absolutely some good uses of physical security measures with access control, surveillance cameras, communications equipment, other types of physical security measures. But we do also find some obstacles with that. We have what we call the CSI effect. People think that you put cameras in schools and there are cameras everywhere and parents come in. We had cameras. Why could you not have known about that sexual assault on my daughter in the back hallway? Or how did you not capture this fight? And related issues. So there is a limitation to that, and we have to be careful because as administrators, board members, superintendents, heads of school, we like to use that as a crutch, a tool to say, okay, we had these incidents, but we put in some cases now we've had schools that have shut down literally for a month to put in metal detectors after some fights and some other non-shooting related situations. And it's easy to say to parents, see, we put this in. Well, you can also create an over-reliance and an overconfidence in doing that and set up false expectations, basically. There's also the issue, we see those quick one-time installations of cameras and equipment, and there's not a budget for maintenance, repair, and replacement. We go in after schools have put in large amounts of cameras, and a year or two later, we go in and find many of those cameras are not functioning. And we ask why, and the answer is, well, we don't have money at the building level, and we don't have money at the district level, so that we haven't been able to do anything. But it was sort of a knee-jerk expenditure to show people we're doing things. And even with metal detectors, it's almost impossible in a school setting that runs 24/7 in some of your high schools, where schools are part of the critical part of this community. It's just odd that we put in metal detectors in some cases in knee-jerk measures as kids come in during the day, but then we leave the building open in the evening for athletic practices and performing arts and other community use of the facilities. And somebody can walk in, put the weapons in a locker, come in the next morning, go through metal detectors and go get it. And it's sort of defeated that perfect cure that you've presented to the school community. We know the first and best line of defense is a well-trained, highly alert staff and student body. And the technology plays a role, but we need to make sure that we're realizing the limitations on that. Chrissy, do you have any quick comments on that before we move to the next section?
No, although I do want to pull forward a question that was just asked, if that's okay.
Please.
So I think it is, and it is related in terms of understanding, sort of, if I could summarize, sort of understanding that how the relationship between teachers and student, or teachers, administrators, and students, the dynamics when you have students who are not listening to teachers, not listening to administrators. So the direct question is, what are some suggestions, or what can we do, recognizing that students might be different than they were 10 or 5 or 10 years ago and are not listening to teachers. So is there any suggestions for kind of gaining some organization around that?
I think the challenges of with kids today, and I'm a parent of two teenagers, and many times my wife and I think back of, geez, what would life have been like 10 years ago with less social media influences, for example. So there are some differences, but think that one thing that remains, if you're a classroom teacher, I remember Chuck and I were doing an assessment here in Ohio, and we were at a wonderful high school. And we, as part of our security and emergency planning assessments, we asked to speak to focus groups of kids. And we asked, don't always give us the student council, just give us a representative sample of kids. Grab some kids in the hallway, maybe the kids who aren't performing academically that great, or maybe have some behavior issues, bring them into the room and engage our kids. And I think that what I found from the kids, I remember this one school, one of the students said, I asked him, do you have a trusting adult in the building that you have a relationship that you could go to if you have a concern about safety or anything else? And one student said, yeah, it's the secretary and the office support staff member in the front office. She's just wonderful. We've developed a relationship and I could go to her with anything. Another kid said it was the school resource officer. Another kid said, sure, you can have school resource officers, which is the issue they had us evaluating, but not the current people who are here temporarily. We want somebody who actually wants to be here and enjoys working with us and is engaged with us. So I think that point of engagement and relationships, kids will come forward and will listen in many cases to adults they have a trusting relationship with. Now, is that going to cure everything? Certainly we have more disrespect, I think, than we did 3 or 4 decades ago in school behavior issues. I'm not minimizing that, but I do think that it is true engagement with kids and relationships, and kids knowing that the adults really want to be engaged with them that can at least help buffer that a little bit. Chrissy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, as I was sort of thinking through that answer, one of the things that I would say is there is a real truth to the idea of collective behavior. And ultimately, when we think about sort of kids and group think, it's not uncommon to sort of almost feel as the teacher or as the administrator that it's us against them. So that the opportunities that one might take, whether they be in the school leadership role, whether they be in the teacher role, is to kind of understand that collective behavior is real. So that feeling that you might have where there's either based on the question particularly said, if they're scared to ask kids to do something or ask students to do something, if there's just really an anxiety or an unsettling feeling about that. One, that I don't know that is uncommon, given that it's that you have sort of this dynamic where it's not uncommon for collective action to kind of take hold, right? If one kid's disruptive, and it's not addressed quickly, then we tend to see more disruption, and it sort of pilfers out from there. The one piece that I would recommend in particular, again, it's kind of going back to this idea of Maslow. It's an attempt to understand where that's coming from. So is this because of disengagement with the learning? Is it because of peer influence? Is it because of something else, like another need that might not be being met? And again, I fully understand and can sit here and sort of say, like, not, my classroom is college students. I'm not in the same position, but I will say lecturing to a class of 100 or 130 kids, which I probably should say learners, I apologize. They still feel like kids to me, but one of the lessons that I've sort of learned in that process, it's the idea of that idea of sharing and modeling that it's okay to not be perfect. Half the time, I think I've won over the majority of my students by making a mistake and acknowledging that mistake. So I think that the relationship building is huge. However, you can authentically build that relationship. So sometimes it's not necessarily showing vulnerability. It might be showing strength. It might also be showing that you have, the same taste in music, but trying to bring together something that could pull at least one of the kids in could be really helpful.
As a father who's 57, I can say that that engagement is challenging even as a parent. So I learned from my my children as well. I'd like to pivot here a little bit. In the last 15 minutes or so that we have, we will touch upon assessing threats, school board meeting security, and wrap up with some strategic crisis leadership points. But I'd like to share screen here and take a little risk taking myself to make sure technology will work, and show the pre-recorded interview that runs for about the next 10 minutes or less with Dr. Erica Carswell, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, what that really looks like. And I think some people will find her comments interesting and informative, and employee wellness. So we're going to share screen. And I am going to start this up. Today about diversity, equity, and inclusion. What does that mean? And what roles do DEI components play in creating a safe schools climate in general, and as we look now to returning to in-person learning?
That's a really great question. And I have to tell you, when we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, it comes in many forms. We've seen a rise in the amount of coverage about DEI since the murder of George Floyd. When we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're looking at it from a perspective, not just race, not ethnicity, not just religious, but looking at the intersectionality between all of those, including individuals with exceptionalities. One of the biggest challenges that I have seen is that we've moved away from the authentic meaning behind DEI. And we see a lot of organizations that are in more of a performative stance, where we're looking at diversifying our marketing materials and our websites, but losing the core feature of diversity, equity, inclusion, which is the heart of people and understanding and embracing all of the uniqueness that comes into our settings, especially our school settings.
When returning to in-person learning, what are some of those things that you're seeing and that you think should be at the top of school administrators' list today as we go back to and hopefully stay in-person learning?
Absolutely. When we're looking from a special education standpoint, I think one of the critical things that needs to take place very early on, as students are becoming more reintegrated back into the school system from virtual learning, we've got to look at individualized education plans, look at those IEPs, look at those goals. We need to make sure that we're providing adequate support to not only remediate, but to make sure that we truly understand the current levels of academic and functional performance. For some of our students, being virtual, that impacted their social skills in ways that we are yet to see. But we know that we're seeing more aggression in schools. We know that we're seeing more fights in general, but also just the ability to relate with peers and their teachers to make we agree that remote learning is unhealthy academically, socially, emotionally, and we agree that the social and emotional stressors that kids are facing and the anxiety is what's manifesting in the form of this violence. To me, it seems like to be a huge disconnect to say, let's go back to remote learning because we just want to escape this for a few days as an adult to figure out what's going on or to let things calm down. Right. I think you hit the nail on the head. We know that there was a lot of transition with moving to virtual learning. There were advantages in terms of communication between adults, but we know that it really did impact our students on a fundamental level. When we're looking at going back to virtual learning as a response to violence in schools and behavioral issues in schools, that's not tackling that root cause. We know what we need to be targeting: the system, the culture, making sure that we have appropriate supports for students. What does our counseling look like? What are the supports that are available to students in school so that we can provide them with the skills that they need to operate as they come back into the system versus shutting down as an immediate response? Because then all you're doing is reinventing the wheel every time you have to bring students back to school instead of having systems in place to address their needs.
Well, where do you see the most common gaps administratively based on your decades of experience in this area? And what would fix it?
I don't know that there's a singular fix, but I know that there needs to be more teacher voices at the table. The teachers are the ones on the front lines of the classroom that have the most direct access to the students that are being served, that know the needs of their students, and they also know their needs as educators to be able to effectively do their job. When decisions are being made, when plans are being discussed, and when new models of instruction are being created, you need to have those teacher voices at the table, not in the performative stance where, oh, there were teachers on the committee, but you need to be listening to those teacher voices to help guide the direction that's being established.
If we look at the fights, if we look at the aggression, what are a couple things that we could do with the kids as far as direct intervention to help try to neutralize that or at least slow it down and to get our arms around that at the building level?
I think at the building level is making sure that your teachers are trained in some of our crisis intervention and prevention strategies. Make sure that that's number one, because the goal is going to be to de-escalate. Once you're able to de-escalate those situations, having those opportunities where students can sit down with the counselor, can sit down with the mentor, can sit down with the buddy program, get those people there to support students to learn how to talk through conflict resolution instead of transitioning into violence as a first response. So I think a lot of those components are going to be geared towards setting up supports, again, for students, making sure that on the classroom level, in the cafeteria, on the playground, that we know we're teaching strategies for conflict resolution so that it's not escalating to violence and some of the school shootings that we've seen.
How can you minimize some of those factors contributing to burnout, or if you can't eliminate them now, which I don't think we can, how can we manage it, and what are some of the best practices?
Yeah, I think we need to look at management, mitigating it right now. When we came back to the new school year, as educators, the expectation was we continue business as usual. First step is we've got to acknowledge it's not business as usual. We're still functioning and operating in a pandemic. It may not look like it did last year, but all of that residual tension, the residual stress, it's still very present. So when we're talking about what does it need to look like on campuses for your educators, we need to stop talking self-care and practicing self-care. Stop adding to teachers' plates without removing something. And the same systems that we're talking about putting in place for students, make sure that they're there for teachers. Acknowledge, we understand the work that you're doing is hard. What can we do to help? What can we do to eliminate some of the stressors that may be coming up? When we're talking about management, there are some schools in here in the Metroplex that have done a great job in terms of Wellness Wednesdays. What does that look like? Well, for some of those schools, the school closes half a day. Students are able to go home and spend their day learning, studying, practicing, a little bit of relaxation. The teachers have a half day in the afternoon where they can take care of the administrative functions of their job. That is very challenging to do when you're teaching bell to bell. Simple things as making sure that your teachers are okay. Ask the question, are you okay? Not making teachers feel guilty if they do need to take time off. We know substitutes are hard to come by, especially within the pandemic. Depending on some schools, you may have subs that are not comfortable there with a mask on or mask off mandatory or voluntary, depending on what the campus chooses. But allowing teachers to acknowledge that they need that time, allowing teachers the time to plan, allowing them to co-plan if you're in a co-teaching situation, especially when it comes to meeting the needs of our learners with exceptionalities, but making sure that teachers have a voice in saying, this is what I need, and trying your best to meet those needs.
The other piece is school administrators. Just an acknowledgement for school administrators. You're so busy managing everybody else's wellness. You need to take care of yourself, because if you're not taking care of yourself, it's going to spew over right into those relationships and interactions with your faculty and staff and your kids. And it's not going to help them either. Find that off button when you go home at night. Put the phone down. Same for our teachers and support system. And put that thing down. Make sure that when you do take those things off the plate, that you are attentive to urgent versus important versus less important, because I did hear of a couple schools, a number of schools, quite frankly, that have not yet reconstituted their school crisis teams, have not updated their emergency plans, and have not had a crisis team meeting because they were trying to clear some things off the deck for their team. And that's certainly admirable, but that would fall under the important. And too often we find that school safety is looked at as important, but not urgent, because many schools have not had a safe or crisis team meeting now for more than a year. The plans that are in place actually still have the names of people who are no longer on the faculty and staff there, who we may have lost, meaning retired, or in some cases totally lost due to COVID. Our wrap up for this is to say, number one, the whole idea of looking at children with exceptionalities and realizing that they've really taken the brunt of this.
Dr. Carswell for her contributions, and I'm thankful that the technology worked to get to share that here in the shared screen as we wrap up here in the last 5 minutes. I know that Dr. Eith has a leadership team meeting immediately to transition to on another Zoom screen at 1. So we thank her for her contributions today as well. A couple of other points on our agenda: assessing and managing threats. We're getting a ton of social media threats. I did 5 news stories in 1 day around the country just dealing with school threats. And from California to Georgia to here in Ohio. Schools should have threat assessment teams, trainings, and protocols in place. There are multiple models out there that we could talk about. Some states are now mandating threats. One of the concerns that we have with a lot of legislative mandates that states are putting out now is that we end up forcing different state agencies to create all these guidelines. And while there should be guidelines and some parameters, perhaps legislatively, it's challenging when we get 60, 70, 80-page plans from their templates from states as a result of these legislative mandates, because that only opens up schools to spending more time generating templates and documents, which most people don't recognize at the building level. We've gone in and talked to administrators from superintendents down to custodians who said, yeah, we have a plan, it's 80 pages, it's fill in the blank. And it's also a great tool for against school districts in civil litigation. So that's another topic, but we do suggest you have flexible school threat assessment teams, training, and protocol to deal with these threats as they emerge. And that's really a whole separate webinar and separate conversation. The other topic was school board meeting security. And for the sake of time, Chuck and I will say that we have spent a couple decades talking about this in our security and emergency planning assessments for schools. We always recommend tightening up central office building security, and we'll ask and to almost to the building, out of all the schools we've worked with, the central office team and leadership team, superintendents will tell us, well, we don't do fire drills here at central office. We've never done a lockdown. We don't have a crisis team here. We haven't practiced an evacuation. Those are things that we do in the buildings, but yet the things that are required of every other site on a district are not done at central office. And with school board meetings in particular, I wrote an article on that district administration back in 2012 that still applies today. And we have a number of pieces of information on the website about that. There are things you can do with physical security, with emergency planning, with training your board meetings, and train your board members rather, physical layout of your board meeting. So we have a whole section on that on the website and a training as well. I'd like to wrap up the last 2 minutes here just by talking about strategic crisis leadership and risk intersection with risk and crisis communications, which happens to be the focus of my EDD research at Johns Hopkins. and under the supervision of Dr. Eith. It's really been critical and very timely as research and information on strategic crisis leadership and high ambiguity and uncertainty is unfolding very rapidly with COVID. But there are 5 critical tasks for strategic crisis leadership, and we don't have time to go through all of those, but 2 are sense making and meaning making. Sense making is the ability of leaders to quickly assess what's going on, and meaning making is defining what those situations are to your key stakeholders, and how you as leaders must create a definition that you can communicate effectively to your stakeholders as part of your leadership effort. So know that there really are some training opportunities for your leadership teams on strategic crisis leadership. Chuck and I just went through last year Red Team training, where it's contrarian thinking and bias confirmation identification that they use. Really, it started in militaries that's going into corporations, and we're looking at bringing some of this to reinforce what we do in our tabletops and leadership training in schools. And risk communications, why the traditional models of communications in school public relations just don't work today in communicating effectively with parents and the community due to the rapid communication cycle. We used to say a 24-hour news cycle. Now it's a 24-minute or maybe 24-second cycle with the traditional media and social media as well. And a final point, do your homework as school leaders. Check the credibility of your sources. We're finding that hardware and product vendors and their business development staff are now out at education conferences, kind of paying their way, buying access at professional associations and state conferences and government programs that are sponsored. And they're business development people with no experience or expertise in working in schools. They're trying to sell products and all. So with that, we close, and I thank our panelists for their contributions, and we'll share to everyone else our website at www.schoolsecurity.org. You can find the blog that we write articles on that can be pushed out to you on current issues. It's not spam, it's very timely, deeper dives on some of these issues. We have a podcast, the School Safety Insider, that we're bringing hot topics on that you can listen to during the course of your day or to and from work. And we do have information on our consultations and our training as well. So we thank you very much. We realize that time is the only thing that we have less of than money in our schools today. And I thank our panelists again. And most of all, I thank you for joining us. We will put this webinar on demand up on the website at schoolsecurity.org. Share that on our social sites for those who did not get to participate. So with that, we say stay safe. Please feel free to follow up at Ken at schoolsecurity.org. Send an email, reach out. Look at our facebook.com/school safety Facebook page and our Twitter account at Safe Schools. We're here to answer questions and to be supportive, and stay healthy, stay well, and stay safe. Thank you.